a real pleasure to introduce Jerry Rosiek. And the first time that I went to ARA, I heard you speak, Jerry, and I know that Viv Boselek, who's in the room, said to me, several times, you really have to go to the ARA because you really get to the heart of those kind of discussions about posthumanism and post-qual and new materialism, and the people that you read are the ones that you can then listen to, but also engage with and discuss. And I wasn't disappointed, and as I said before we started this Zoom meeting, is how your paper really reminds me of these very important discussions that are held at the American Educational Research ALRA Association annual meetings, because it's so big that this, especially the special interest groups, then become more or less a conference in its own right. So I've always really enjoyed going to them. So Jerry is Professor of Education Studies, College of Education, Critical and Social Cultural Studies in Education. My goodness, Curriculum and Teaching, Curriculum and Teacher Education, Educational Foundations, Food Studies, and IRES?
The Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies.
Okay, well, that's very important, isn't it? So what is also important that you're a former high school physics teacher and a father of a daughter in middle school. Is she still there? I don't know. Sometimes
No, that needs to be updated. She just graduated from high school. So.
Okay. So obviously you're professor of education at the University of Oregon. And you also hold courtesy appointments in the Department of Philosophy and the Department of Ethnic Studies. You teach courses on teacher education and curriculum theory and institutionalized racism in schools, philosophy of social science, and qualitative research methodology. So you're very busy, that's for sure. And you have spare time. You play in your spare time racquetball. I don't know that. Yeah, you're probably very passionate about that. Maybe I should start you off.
It's been a while.
Oh, okay. And you're pitmaster on an award-winning competition BBQ team.
A barbecue. Yes.
A barbecue team. Okay.
My Texas roots.
Okay. You spend time with your family hiking, kayaking, and getting creative in the kitchen. And when you Google Jerry Rosiek, so the name and education of Oregon, you can also see in what kind of journals you tend to publish. And I always think that that's useful as well, because I don't know about you, but other people, is it often when we write an article, think, oh, where should we now publish this? Where should we go? And sometimes it's good to go to people whose work you really like and then say, well, where do they publish? And yeah, anyway, so have a look, because otherwise we run out of time if you have published so much. But there might be a book that you particularly like us to mention. There's a book entitled Posthumanist Empiricism, Agency, Ethics and Politics and Social Inquiry. And that is together with Scott.
That's one we're hopefully finishing up this year. So we're working on that. That's in process.
Okay, yeah. Lovely. So
it's very related to the review article, in fact.
Okay, brilliant. So welcome. And the way it went was that Jerry, and it's worth mentioning because it's not often, I think, this happens. And when you were doing your review article, before it was published, you got in touch with me and said, oh, actually, you feature in this article. Would you mind just having a look? Didn't you? And and I think that's great. That is such fantastic ethical practice, and gave me the opportunity to see whether I was happy that, but also then I thought, wow, this is something that our community would really benefit from and like to have presented. And then you said yes, and then we had to find a space, and it seems such a wonderful start to our new academic year. I know in the South, it's not the new academic year. There it starts in February, goes to November. but for us, it's a new academic year in Finland and in a lot of other countries as well. So it's yeah. And George will say a little bit more at the end of what else is going to happen this month in terms of our Monday meetings. So yeah, I suppose, shall I just hand over to you, Jerry, unless George, tell me if I did already introduce you as the, yes, I did, hey, as
Yeah.
the assistant of this research collective, and she always, I wouldn't be able to do it without without George. So I'll hand over, and I think you might want to share your screen.
Yeah, I'll do that in just a second. Thank you so much for having me here, and I'm really excited to talk to this whole group and your extended network. I want to acknowledge that I'm here to talk about an article that I co-wrote with 3 other people. Mary John Adkins Carty, who's now at Grand Valley State University in the state of Michigan in the United States. Kevin Donnelly, who's working as a postdoc at Georgetown University, and Alex Pratt, who's in the room and is a professor at Penn State Altoona here in the United States. So this was a collective effort. There's lots of ways to introduce this. I think it's better just to continue with what you were doing, Karen, and kind of narrate how we got to this place. As often happens when you're an academic, most of the most interesting conversations start in collaboration with graduate students. And so this was now over 4 years ago. Alex, Kevin, and I were having conversations about where their dissertations were going and the need to have a body of literature, a reviewed body of literature on what we called at that time the posthumanist research methodology literature, to kind of figure out, because there were so many things going on inside of that literature, trying to get a sense of the topography of the different ways people were moving through that landscape. So we basically just undertook the project to create a database for ourselves of these different kinds of these different approaches, these different emerging approaches to research. And it quickly became a sprawling project. We're a year into it, and we realized we've done a lot of work and we haven't really gotten that far into the literature. And we decided that, okay, this shouldn't just be something we're doing for our bibliographies of our articles and your dissertations. We looked around and said, this might actually be worthwhile to present as a review article. We made a proposal to I always get them mixed up. There's the Review of Research and Education, RRE, and there's the Review of Education Research. And it's the Review of Research and Education, the annual book that ARA puts out. And they just sent out a call, and it was not a call that fit what we were doing very easily. The call was for review articles on the concept of side effects in research. Now, side effects are very much a positivist concept, and so, here's the research we're doing, we're finding out some truth, and then what are these side effects of the process that we're studying, not just its intended effect. So just as a sort of lark, we decided to pitch it. And the way we pitched the review article was to say, look, there's side effects, and then there's just the whole idea that there's a difference between side effects and effects in general. And it turns out there's a whole history of literature out there that treats the entire sort of horizon of effects of research as an unbounded area of study. And so this goes from Marxism through post-structuralism into posthumanism. So in a proposal, we sort of pointed this out to the editors and said, in order to broaden your portfolio of this book of review articles, this would actually address a whole set of literatures that you don't necessarily deal with. So getting to your point about how do you choose which journals to publish something in, and how do you go about doing that, that's the approach we took. I kind of figured that pitch wouldn't work, and that we would have to wait till the next iteration of the review publication to pitch it, but they accepted it. And then we had like eight months to write the article that we had been compiling articles about for 2 years. So that's the sort of the practical kind of history of the piece. I'm going to share a couple of links in the chat because I'm going to be speaking from some slide notes, but I'm not going to put them up on screen because they're just text and they're mainly for me. But if anybody wants to follow along, I'm going to put this first one in. So these are Prezi slides. This link should get people to the slides. And then I'm going to put another link up. This is to a web page we've created with support documents for the review article. And I'll say more about it in a minute. And then I'll briefly, if any of you are watching this from an iPhone, I will put up a QR code in case you want to.
Yeah, I can't do this one. That's weird.
Is the link not working?
I have to pay.
Oh, wait.
No, it worked for me.
Okay. So the QR code is for the
phone
blog with all the resources.
Okay.
So the review that we undertook, the conceit of most reviews are that you stand at a 30,000 feet remove and then describe everything you see. For those of you who are familiar with post-qualitative and post-humanist research, you know that that fundamental premise is problematic because most of this literature regards inquiry as not transcendent, but not producing transcendent knowledge, but an imminent kind of action that takes place in the midst of ongoing social, cultural, and discursive material processes. So we very much qualify when we undertook this review and started writing it up, that that's not what we're up to. We're not trying to give a definitive view of the entire field. What we're trying to do is to talk about the field from within it and to offer a form of intervention that is deliberate and that we're trying to make a constructive contribution that helps bring different elements of the conversation about what these various theories have to say about doing research, particularly in the field of education, because they don't all say the same thing. And I'm going to highlight just a couple of the main features of the article that I think are useful, and then hopefully we can have a conversation about those. First, we define the term posthumanism very broadly. It's a contested term. It's a term that not everybody's comfortable with. We went back and forth about a lot of terms. There's no term to settle on easily. But part of what we did is we included within the concept of, within the term posthumanism, all research that scholarship that focused on the idea that research was an immanent process, not a transcendent process that happens within. It's a relationally generative process, which means it's not simply creating a representation of the world that we stand back from, but it's actually an ontological intervention in the world that relationally changes things as it goes forward. We also took a few other themes like a focus on the ethics and politics of research, a focus on the concept of non-human agency. And what we then did is look to the literature to find other forms of research that took up those themes, not necessarily only research that described itself as post-humanist. There's all kinds of risks with this. So in doing that, we explicitly included the work of indigenous studies scholars who write about research methodology and take up themes of non-human agency and take up things of relational responsibility. We also looked at some of the Black studies literature and Afrofuturism and Afro-pessimist literature that does similar things, particularly research that's been influenced by the work of Sylvia Wynter's counterhumanism. There's no comfortable way to engage that kind of inclusiveness because It can be regarded as inclusiveness as a politically positive action, but it also can be regarded as appropriation. So there's a way in which broadening out that term and bringing it in underneath the umbrella of posthumanism for the purposes of this review is not necessarily a there's the risk of that being a way to domesticate the more ambitious political aspects of the Indigenous studies and Black studies literature. And we did work to try to avoid that, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there are always risks, and part of that risk is entailed not just in how we wrote it, but in how people choose to read it and take it up. So we did this. The other side of that is we could have not have done that inclusion, but then that involves the risk of erasing the significance of that literature. And all of us had been actually influenced by this broader scope of the literature. So inclusion seemed both more honest and more necessary as a political process, a political stance than to exclude it. So that's the sort of circumscription of the topic. We had a couple of goals. One was that in the posthumanist literature, as we read it, there was a tension between folks who wrote about the ontologically generative and fluid processes that we are trying to describe in the world, and wanted to talk metaphysically about and ontologically how things that we're researching aren't stable ontologically, that they're sometimes discursive, sometimes material, sometimes both, and that they're not just the topic, not just the content, but the actual nature of the phenomenon changes depending on how we relate to it. So for everybody who's read Karen Barad, this will be very familiar, that the act of research is a form of entanglement. And so the object is not stable. It actually manifests in relation as we come into the inquiry. So there are examples of research that we've fallen under this broad term posthumanism that we're describing that try to describe that as a process. Like, let's look at the way in which this phenomenon, I'm thinking of Ezekiel Dixon Roman's work on educational testing, and trying to describe how complicated the socio-material processes are that produce and reproduce testing and educational achievement data, and how that's entangled up with racism, and talking about this just churning mass of different kinds of material and social and discursive and affective elements that you can't pin down, because every time you try and pin them down, you're actually engaged in an act that is part of the process. So Ezekiel describes that in his work. And that aspect of Ezekiel's work is an example of how we have a more complicated view of the phenomenon of the unit of analysis that we're studying. We realize that it's not just a thing that's materially in process, but it's actually ontologically in process. It's actually moving. Then there are folks, we call that descriptive forms of posthumanist research. And then there's research that seeks not to describe processes, but to engage in a process of writing or performance that seeks to transform the reader audience's relationship and even the inquirer's relationship to the phenomenon itself. So in that sense, to use a more familiar word, it's more performative. It's a research that's trying not to describe the phenomenon, but through its presentation to transform the relation to the phenomenon, which is different than trying to make an accurate representation of something's going on. We call these in the field, there's a tension between these two views, because we read literature. I think Levi Taguchi's written along these lines early in her work, not so much lately. Maggie McClure has written about this, that at some level, a descriptive approach to these sort of posthumanist projects is read as a slide back into humanist spectator subjectivity from the Enlightenment. It's read as somehow degraded form of posthumanism, and it's really the more performative engagement that people are reaching for. But we didn't find any real examples, very few examples, that could avoided or even tried to avoid engaging in descriptive language entirely, right? So we came to the conclusion that it wasn't terribly useful to think of this as a binary of either things sort of slide back into a humanist subjectivity, slide back into a form of description that produces the human spectator subject, and a type of writing that is more perhaps arts-based, perhaps crafted in its prose forms to be transformative of subjectivities, as opposed to producing a familiar form of researcher subjectivity and scholarly subjectivity. So we pose those as a continuum from descriptive to inactive forms of posthumanist research, and wanted to talk about both of them and where their value was and what they did. To do that, the article, for those of you who read it, this will be familiar. We looked at assemblage studies, cartographic studies, diffractive studies, and place-based studies. This by no means was a comprehensive coverage of all the types of research there were. We give a long list at one point of other types of research that we found in the literature, but these gave us a way to talk about this continuum from descriptive to inactive forms of posthumanist research, concluding that each of them accomplished different things and important things, and that we should allow for them to operate in the way in which they seem to be trying to operate. Also, didn't claim any sort of clear boundaries between those categories. They were used to illustrate this concept. So those were the first two kind of the agendas behind our review. Again, we're not trying to present a review like this is the totalizing view of the entire field, and the only one that anybody can have a conclusion who reviews the literature would come to the similar conclusion. That's not true. We're trying to actually broaden out the definition of posthumanism because we think that's a vibrant and important political thing to do, and we're also trying to sidestep the sort of tension between descriptive forms of prose and more inactive or performative forms of scholarship, and to allow a space for those to be in conversation and be included in the same projects or across the conversation within this field. We think that's constructive and productive. And then the final and probably most important aspect of this paper that I hope comes across, I think we're all really committed to, is that there's also a tension that's related to this performative versus this inactive versus a descriptive approach to posthumanist research. And that is, where do the ethics and the politics of, where's the axiology of posthumanism come in? Because there's an element of the posthumanist research that is deeply post-foundational or anti-foundational. There's a sort of commitment to a form of deterritorialization, a commitment to not reifying the object of analysis as if it's the only object with a relation to the thing we're studying that is possible, that every move in an inquiry is constituting both us as subjects and the phenomenon that we're studying. So there's a fluidity to it. But if that's all we emphasize, there's something problematic about that, because this becomes this is very similar to the emphasis on ontological irony in post-structuralism, which doesn't provide an easy framework for a concrete politics of inquiry when we're engaged in various particular forms of social and political struggle. So we looked through the research for ways in which people articulated the purpose of the posthumanist research. And we found three basically different or three genres of ways in which people describe the connection between the inquiry and their anticipation of its possible effects on the future, or what we call futurities. One is, the first is a conception that if we can just render the object of study fluid, if we can have a conception of our inquiry as an entanglement, not as a representation of the world, by making the object of study fluid, we thereby weaken the grip of imperial political projects that rely on epistemic certainty for their justification, that by pulling that plank out from underneath the work of epistemic empire, we're actually opening up possibilities that can go in all kinds of directions that will hopefully be good. So it's kind of a liberatory project. We point out that that kind of liberatory project of post-foundationalism or anti-foundationalism, while certainly, as you know, I'm persuaded by it, we can't be sure that openness and a fluid relation to the phenomenon we're studying always turns out in a positive direction. Certainly we may be leaving something that's bad, but that doesn't mean we're not moving from the frying pan into the fire. So the question is, where does it take us when we, you know, avail ourselves of the openness of a post-foundational, an ontologically fluid relationship to our research? The second sort of way in which people engage with this, we located in affect theory and some work of other folks that talk almost at a phenomenological level about how it is that we should respond to data and to research. For example, how should we, like how do we know what to pay attention to if what we're paying attention to isn't the truth of the phenomenon we're studying? And Maggie McClure has some really great writing on this. She talks about the paying attention to data that glows, right? That you have to be able to listen to various impressions and kind of an impressionistic approach to the research, because you no longer have a procedural way to connect your representations and thoughts about things to some sort of absolute metaphysically present phenomenon. So the alternative is learning how to tune into these things. People use different words. They use words like leads. They use words like lures. They use words like attunement. There's a lot of emphasis on this. And Greg Sigsworth says that part of the project of research and learning to be a researcher is learning how to tune ourselves into these affective relations that can help us move towards more ameliorative futurities. So that's at the more micro level. So you give up on a foundation and you have a horizon of openness is one conception of the futurity. Another is we need to pay attention to the elements of our experiences in the research process, what pulls us forward and why it pulls us forward and what pulls us forward too. And the final version of futurity that we located in the research was a longer term sort of political projects, often ones that are more familiar and sort of discursively the paths are already laid out for them. For example, anti-racist research, decolonial research, people who are using this research and to put it into the service of particular kinds of political projects that are related to the place they're in and the things that they're doing. And they often narrate this on a longer basis. I'm thinking of Fikele Numalo's work, where she talks about working with very young children and watching Black children play in an outdoor education setting. In the United States of America, Fikele and others have pointed out that teachers often have a hard time even imagining Black children as children. They don't regard their activity as playing, they regard their activity as transgressive. And so she's looking for a research method that doesn't actually describe the reality of a child's inner experience, but reframes it so that the relationship between the teachers and the children are transformed in a way that resists this anti-Blackness and makes for a more ameliorative relationship between the children and the teacher. So that's a really particularly longer term project that she narrates while she's engaged in this research that she calls listening to images. So those are the three things, and we eventually conclude that the posthumanist research that we're reviewing is most powerful when it's engaging those futurities at all three of those levels. All three seem to be important in very particular ways, and we describe that. And that's where we concluded the review. Those are very specific kind of engagements with the field. They're not, like I said, again, not an attempt to say this is what the field is, but here's a stepping back and looking at a lot of different elements of the research as we're in the middle of it. And here's some things we think help us navigate this very exciting and very complex territory. So that's summary of the article.
Brilliant. Okay, I have to get yeah, that will continue for us to be accessible, doesn't it? Presentation. So I just go back to the Zoom. I mean, one of the things that we thought might be a good idea because, you know, you left generous time for us to, you know, to engage in questions. And so we discussed beforehand, maybe if we can go into breakout rooms and discuss, first of all, whether there were any questions, and also quite a few people here don't know each other, I would have thought. So you can briefly introduce yourselves, but then really just say, well, for people who have or haven't been able to read it for themselves, but it's really nice actually to see the way you've laid out the structure of the paper, and very, very helpful. So how does it sound for people? Yeah? Yeah? Would that be okay? Maybe groups of what, 3? And then maybe 10 minutes? Yeah?
Cool.
Viv, I was just wondering, would you like to stay in the main room and then I can introduce you to Jerry? Yeah. So, and maybe Alex? Are you called Alex? Or Alexander? Yeah, maybe you can stay in the
Alex works.
Alex works. Okay, maybe you can stay in the main room, and then George, would you mind putting
Yeah,
people in?
sure.
I don't know, it's kind of
Prepare to be prepare to be transported. I'm just gonna make mm, 4 rooms and that should work. Okay, great.
you. I'm a bit rusty, I have to say. It really is the beginning of the
Mhm. It's funny how when you said that, we lost like 5 people from the call.
Yeah.
We're like,
Oh no, we do it to our students. No. Okay. And
more people. Okay, so it's like
lovely. And I think it would be nice to Lima. You are you going to join? Did you put her in a room?
I did, but some people haven't joined the rooms that they were assigned to. I'm gonna do this.
Okay, so we just have to have keep an eye on the time, so that will give us plenty of time, say to 5
Quarter,
or so, yeah.
almost quarter to.
Okay, so I've already been doing a lot of talking, and Jerry, just want to, and Alex, it would be great to introduce you to Viv, and Viv, of course, Bozalek is very much in your article as well, and Viv, we
Hi,
started
Debbie. This is you.
Hi.
the reading group. We were just saying probably 11 years ago, and have been working together, and she was very much part of the collective when it still was a funded project, but still, you know, we're just there all the time and, you know, running this together, the 3 of us. So I thought it would be nice to introduce you to Viv. And Alex, when I didn't know you were going to be in the room, so it's great to meet you too. So I'm a professor of early childhood education at the University of Oulu, but worked for a long time in at the University of Cape Town. And Viv, maybe you would like to introduce yourself too.
Okay, thank you. I have met Jerry on a few occasions actually. I think it don't know if it's ARA, but perhaps there, and also ECQI conferences. I think I remember talking to you in Malta at some particular
that was
point.
great.
Yeah, but I don't know Matt. I
Yeah.
don't think. So yeah, it's very nice to see you and to read what you have to say. And it's always, interesting for me to see, who or what comes up as studies one would consider and on what basis. I mean, interestingly, you did write about how you went about it, which I think is always, informative. But besides the human element, I'm wondering how these algorithms work. And, do we each have our own algorithm? Because I think that depending on which computer, like you can have a work computer and a home computer. And when you think of, Siri listening in actually to what we're saying, and, you're just talking about something and suddenly you see it on your social media. What effects does this have? And, who gets to become prominent? So that's a very interesting thing for me to consider.
Yeah.
In terms of, of your piece. And we've also engaged in a similar one. You've probably seen that one on teaching qualitatively. And, who comes up? Well, I noticed, I don't think you had many people from South America there, or there weren't people from animal study. Like my favorite, Vincent Desprez, like doesn't appear. And then there was nothing about the ocean, and there's and then when you look at disciplines, I've just been looking at the discipline of psychology, who are very antsy about post-qualitative, and because they're trying their best to be scientific, and they say, well, we've only just accepted qualitative research now, why must we move away from that? So I mean, these are, it seems so arbitrary in a way who we alight on, and who gets, I suppose also those H indexes, I see that you've got Zembilas there. And Zembilas is apparently the second most quoted person in the world in terms of philosophy and education. So, why would Zembilas pop up for post-qualitative research? Yeah, so I mean, maybe we could have a discussion about that. I don't know if you're interested in that, Karen, too.
Yeah, and I think you raised that when we were writing this collaborative paper, Teaching Post-Qualitative Research, which has just come out in QI. Yeah. And that was such an important point, is what is and what isn't picked up, and also, which actually is not the case with you, but as soon as you've got child in your even a conference paper or your presentation, you just sort of lose 99% of the serious kind of audience. So what is it that gets, gets there? Because it's interesting, the point you make about Michaelinas's research in terms of post-humanist and post-qual. And also what you just, when I publish in the South in really good journals, and Viv, she manages one, and it just is rigorous, and it is, but you just know it is one, and I published quite a bit in it from Brazil. It just doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't cite, it's not cited, and so it's not picked up. So you do sense in your article an enormous dominance of, but not as much as I would have expected, of the kind of main or the people really that are publishing a lot in sort of the Western journals, and therefore they will be picked up. So it's especially in the context of ethics and responsibility, which you put a lot of emphasis on. But you must have been having this discussion, right, amongst yourselves, and it would be lovely to hear from Alex as well, and maybe Alex, if you can introduce yourself as well, which would be great.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead, Jane.
I think George has a question.
Yeah.
I just have a technical question. How long are we gonna leave people in the
I think we said
waiting room for?
10 minutes.
Okay,
It was
10, that's
15,
fine.
it
So
was
then I'm
10,
just gonna,
another 5, yeah?
it
Or
was at 2, we put them in at 42 minutes past, so it's been
oh,
7
okay.
minutes.
So shall we then have
Um,
6 minutes?
I think I'll just send a message saying that we're gonna let
Okay.
them back in 2 minutes, or that we'll close the groups, and should I maybe ask that they come back with a question or a thought to share?
Yeah, fabulous. Where would I be
Cool.
without you?
Thanks. Sorry to please go ahead, Alex.
I'm Alex Pratt. I was a graduate student at Jerry's till 22, I believe I graduated, I hope. Uh, and yeah, we worked on this. We started this around his kitchen island 5 years ago, I think at this point.
The best
And it
place.
was, yeah, it was a very long, involved process that involved a lot of reading of a lot of different articles. And I think, Dr. Bozalek, your point is really an interesting one about sort of what shows up when you do your searches. And I think it's pretty clear what I am interested in based on my searches. So if I search for posthumanism and education, curriculum theory, racism, etc. The answers that I get are those answers that are centered on sort of the lit review that we did, and I think that that's sort of the it's the blinding that happens when we engage with the algorithms, the sort of ways that it becomes really difficult to engage with some of those other literatures. One of the things that we did in terms of sampling that was intended to sort of push out beyond that, but I don't think it ended up doing that, was to do snowball sampling, where we would read something and then go straight to the reference list, find things that they cited, articles, people, etc., and then go find those people. And that, while that may have been an attempt to get around the algorithm, we were just sort of putting ourselves at the mercy of a different algorithm. We were putting ourselves at the mercy of whoever that author was.
Yeah.
So I think that this is a really interesting conversation to have, because it is the kind of thing that limits something. Even though we looked at this as being this huge, broad research review, it ended up having these boundaries that we didn't. We hoped to surpass, but I think that, to your point, we didn't do nearly as much as could have been done to get outside of those. So sorry, we're at the 10. I didn't want to keep
There
going.
was
You want to get in or you want to get back? Yeah.
well, I was just thinking about, there wasn't much Australian stuff I didn't see. Even at sort of like Linda Smith, for example, who's very much thinking about indigeneity and so yeah, it's just interesting who comes up, who pops up.
We did create, for that reason, a more expanded bibliography, because the bibliography was so long that it would have taken up the entire word space for the article. So we created our website that has the Zotero file for all of the articles we reviewed and the expanded bibliography of which we keep adding to for all.
Yeah, it would be also quite nice to open that up. I don't know how it would work or whether you would get a lot of spam, but to open it up to a broader audience and see what happened.
So we've talked
sort of
about this,
yeah,
about making the files available for other people to edit, but it doesn't feel responsible at this point. So we're just having people, we haven't gotten a lot of feedback yet, but just a couple people. So when people send us stuff, we then review the abstracts and we include them. So we're curating it, but pretty much we're including everything that seems relevant, just so it's there for people to have access to. I don't know how long we can sustain that labor, or if it gets really intense. And maybe it would make sense at some point to create one that is actually universally available and just have people add anything into it. But I would be worried about, that seems like a different thing than us curating something for people. And they both have their limits.
I mean, what I suggest is people, if they've got a question generated in the breakout rooms, that they can put it in the chat, and then we can already look at it. But also just to say that the discussion that we had here, and it was especially in response to a question by Viv Bozalek about the algorithms, so that when you put a review article of all the literature together, you know, how does that work, and who is privileged, who is included, who is excluded, and of course also raises, I suppose, a methodological question about, you know, is it representational? You know, and I'm sure that you've had those discussions yourselves of, you know, could you do a review of the literature in a post-qual way, in a non-representational way, and what would that be like, you know?
Well, we tried in our circumscription of the topic to just emphasize both at the beginning and at the end of the article that this is not an effort to give a definitive account of the field, that it is intervention, and in to be consistent with our own sort of account of futurities, we actually point out that there's an agenda, some things we're trying to accomplish by enriching the conversation in very particular ways, and the review is designed to accomplish those ends, so that its justification exists in where it goes and what it does, not in what it represents. Because for all the reasons you described, you can't comprehensively represent this dynamically evolving field. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't be talking about it and shouldn't be, you know, working in it. So we tried to avoid the pretensions of authoritative representation, but it's inherent in the concept of a review that it feels like you're doing that, even if you say you're not.
Okay, so let's have a look whether people are writing the questions they generated. We would love you to respond to in the chat, or maybe people would like to speak it. That's maybe also really nice. You can do either or. When you're in the small groups, did anyone have, or you might have already had one before you joined today? Anybody? You can just raise your hand, or you can use the emoticon, or stand on your head. You look puzzled. Yeah, go on then. I knew something was coming. Come on.
Hi, Jerry. Thank you. I have a question because I mean, in that way, I thought it was really interesting the way that I obviously want to position then my own work into this or not or whatever, and you know, you see yourself because it gives you some sort of language to look at what you do, maybe sort of consciously or unconsciously. But I wonder how you think, you know, aren't there like articles so basically where different parts are more sort of based on the sort of enact, describe section, you know, that in a way do both, or they have certain parts doing this or certain parts doing that. So how would you, you know, or how did you handle that, you know, if you want to make those categories in, because that's how I feel with my own work, that they're very sort of this very different sections.
Within one paper, you mean?
Yeah, but when you've been produced the article, for example, then you would say, if this approach more enacted, and then we say, yeah, part of it, but then there are also sort of, there's more representational language in certain parts, and then there are other parts which are very performative. I mean, Carrie, you know, in a way, our work. So that's, how would you, you know, tackle that in this review then, if you want to open up those descriptions?
So the purpose of positing a sort of descriptive or an active continuum is to resist that binarism and to talk about it as a continuum. That some articles are doing both at various times. Some articles are doing more of one and a little bit of the other. You know, I think I mentioned already Ezekiel Dixon Roman's really great book, Inheriting Possibilities, which has a whole lot of descriptive in it about about the ways and the history of and the use of standardized testing data, and the ways in which the sort of data industry produces certain kinds of educational effects, including reproduction of racist stratification of educational opportunity. But he's also engaged in a diffractive process in which he's not leading you to a particular conclusion. He's complicating through juxtaposition your relationship to the concept of data and to knowledge about education at all. So that there's something both inactive about what he's doing, but there's a whole lot of it that's descriptive. So the purpose of the concept of the continuum is to do exactly what you described. Like, and ultimately, it's not whether you're doing an active or descriptive work. In my opinion, it's what are you up to, right? What are you doing with your research? And if a form of descriptive prose is working to do the thing you're trying to do, that's what you're really accountable to, not to describing it in some sort of final, accurate representation. I mean, I think we should all pay attention to accuracy of representation within the frameworks we're working in. It's important. That's important for all kinds of reasons. But it's not there's, like, as Karen said, it's a meta-methodological ethic, right? What are you up to by asserting this particular form of descriptive accuracy at this particular moment? And how does that work? So I think it's not to avoid the description, it's to be much more ethically rigorous about why is that standard for descriptive accuracy really important right now, and what are its effects other than the ones that you might intend.
Just ending off there. I'll be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Finn has got maybe you would just want to say it, Finn?
It's lovely to be here, and thank you very much, Jerry. The article is really interesting and inspiring. I'm interested in assemblage studies because I hadn't heard of that concept before. I'd heard of assemblages, but assemblage studies and recognizing the expanse of that, and yet the potential it has is both exciting and terrifying. And I just wondered, as a single researcher halfway through doctorate studies, is there any kind of advice you would give on how to, I don't know, open that space a bit more and understand what I can do within it?
Yeah, so the term assemblage, of all the language that we, have been gifted by Deleuze and Guattari, has been just taken off in so many different directions. So it kind of has a life of its own. Just at the beginning, I don't know how attracted you are to sort of like the base philosophical literature, but there was a kind of debate that went on between DeLanda, who wrote about assemblage studies, and Ian Buchanan, who basically wrote a critique of how DeLanda does assemblage studies and the way in which that term has been taken up. I really like the way Buchanan writes about these things, Ian Buchanan. I'd be happy if you emailed me. I'd send you the 2 citations I'm thinking about. But so if you had those 2 sort of articles, or book and article, I think they're both books, in your head while you're navigating this territory, I think it would be really helpful. Because the word assemblage, of course, is not the original word. I don't speak French, but agentisement, I think, is the original word in the French that Deleuze and Guattari wrote. It has certain kinds of meanings, and it was translated by Masumi as assemblage, and people have translated it in different ways, but Masumi's translation is what really is caught on and circulated and been generative. I think there are really different ways in which people deploy that term, which gives you some freedom, which means whatever project you have, you can engage it in a lot of different ways and be absolutely certain that there's probably somebody who's doing something similar. Also be certain that there will be somebody who's dissatisfied with what you're doing. And that's okay. I think that the concept of assemblage can be sort of at its least sort of interesting level be just basically, oh, that's a complicated phenomenon, and I want to describe its complications. And I think Ian Buchanan does a really good job of pointing out why that's not terribly helpful or novel. He points out that there has to be an account of that assemblages have a direction. The term was introduced to analyze power dynamics, and he says assemblages exist for a purpose external to the assemblage, right? And so you have to have in your account of the assemblage the purpose, the organizing purpose that gives it coherence. Alex and I have read a lot of a theorist that nobody else really reads very much, Charles Sanders Peirce, who talks about the ways in which things are organized by futurities or purposes towards which they tend. And I find that the most interesting part of people who are analyzing assemblage studies is to analyze how it is that really disparate ontological elements, matter, money, discourse, feelings, get caught up in systems or assemblages that tend in certain directions. Ian Buchanan is pretty critical of Jane Bennett, who uses that term, because he thinks she just is willing to put anything together as an assemblage and allow it to be an assemblage. And he thinks there's a missing ingredient, which we mentioned earlier, the idea that it has a direction and a purpose.
Yeah.
It gives it coherence. So that's what I think is at stake. Like I said, if you email me, I'm writing a chapter in the book on the logic of posthumanist empiricism that I just spent like 12 pages trying to think through this. So I'd be interested in hearing your feedback on whether it's useful or not.
That would be amazing.
Is
Okay.
it is it now less terrifying, Finn? Or more terrifying? But just following on from that is something I wanted to ask anyway, which was when you were talking about Masumi being the translator of Deleuze and Guattari, and then when you in one of your presentations as well, it's also in the paper where you talk about Masumi being a an Anglo-American philosopher, or you put him in that category, and Deleuze and Guattari not, that's a continental. And then now when you talk about Peirce, which of course is an American pragmatist, so I would be very interested if you say a little bit more about how you use Anglo-American philosophy, because when I think about Karen Barad's work, I wouldn't put them there. I would put them actually under continental philosophy, because Karen Barad works so much with Deleuze, but it's also the way they do philosophy, right? So that it is when I think myself, it's not so much about where we are in the world, how we philosophize, but what are the ontological assumptions and metaphysical assumptions in particular that we bring to our theorizing. And for me, it is when you only stick to, the kind of positivist world as it is in our I haven't really thought about this much, so there's just thinking out loud, but as we perceive it, etc., that and denying that there is a kind of metaphysical realm we need to take account of, that for me will be American philosophy, because Anglo-American, because that's where the split was, in the Enlightenment. So maybe you can say a little bit more why you think, and both of you, as co-authors of this review article, where this split is, that Masumi is because he's an American, or
I don't feel really committed to that kind of
okay.
that particular passage. Like, look, they come from over here, they come from over here. I encountered Masumi early on in his writings about William James and Peirce. And he writes a lot about William James and Peirce in a way that people in this literature don't. And so I probably have an affection for him because he was speaking to a language that I actually, was familiar with early in my engagement with this literature. But I really.
Well, I tell you why I think the deeper point here is, and especially one of the things that I really appreciate about your research is the constant troubling of the Western and westernized approach to, philosophy or posthumanism, which gets the critique a lot, that it is maybe a white privilege, etc., intellectual endeavor. And so when we think about Western philosophy, when I see what Barad does, it is actually from within, in the same way that they do it with quantum physics. It's almost from within, working on Western philosophy through like especially Derrida and all of that. So it is, so the point is there that it's also the troubling of what Western philosophy is and Western thinking, like Haraway, she does that too. Which I think is exciting because, when you talk a lot about, we don't want to set up those binaries. And I think one way also of bringing perhaps closer together is thinking about indigenous philosophies and Western philosophies as something that's always on the move and is also contested from the inside out.
Yeah, I mean, Haraway was very influenced by Peirce's semiotics early in her career. So her writing on cyborgs and her writing on situated knowledges was very informed by a different conception of semiotics that was more material. Also, Haraway has been pretty consistent about engaging indigenous philosophies at various points in her career in a way that her student Karen Broad isn't, right? So I think I read Barad the same way you just said, which is that Barad is actually staging an intervention within the Western canon, you know, against certain kind of metaphysical presuppositions, and it's a very much a project internal to that discourse. I just don't believe those boundaries are non-porous. I believe that conversation, and there's a lot of intellectual historians now who are pointing out that the history of Western thought has always been in commerce at the boundaries with African thought, with thought in the, you know, Southeast Asia, with thoughts with indigenous thinkers, and it's a very complicated boundary, but that boundary constantly gets erased, and then we call it an internal conversation. And that's part of the function of white supremacy, is that we're always aware of this other conversation happening on, but then we turn back inside and allow ourselves to have a conversation that erases the other. And I try to engage in a practice that doesn't do that in my work. And I really feel it's important to encourage, you know, the folks that I work with and the students that I teach, that there's just, you know, we're past the moment in the clock of the world where that's actually an acceptable practice. So I have some disappointment with Barad that she hasn't. I mean, she's clearly aware that these conversations are happening, and that piece on time diffraction, she opens with some analysis of the impact of the nuclear bombs being dropped in the deserts of New Mexico and the impact on indigenous communities, and then has a line where she says, you know, and there's possible connections here, but that's not what I'm going to do, right? So there's this moment like you're passing by the, you know, the storefront, you know, like there it is. Yeah, but I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to go over here. Okay, but that's a decision, right? And you know, it's a legitimate decision, but it probably bears more than just sort of waving out the window of the car as you're going by. So I don't know, that was sort of moving from the fact that I actually consider Haraway to be influenced by, you know, thinkers in the Anglo-English writing tradition and the pragmatist tradition, and how that leads into Barad's work. But there's also a kind of a politics of where you're directing your arguments. And I'm really concerned because I see so much value in the conversation that we're having around all these things, that if this literature doesn't aggressively engage the larger political topics and concepts that are pressing upon our world, then it won't be relevant for very long. And I'm happy to see there's lots of people doing that work, but it's absent in some places that really are surprising to me, I guess is what I would say.
Okay, so there's a response here from Viv, who says Barad is engaged with indigenous knowledges in the Social Justice and Science Project. And I think that's also in the 2019. Yeah, and actually I think the one on time has got lots of sort of deep engagement with colonial time. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to necessarily go into that, but there is a question also here from Hillary, unless there is someone who wants to take it. Okay, so also, yeah, Alex, you are also saying the recent publication with Gendorf does address politics directly, which is a fantastic text. I agree with you. Also nuclear colonialism, says Viv. Yeah. You can also say it. We don't have to write it, but yeah, I mean, it would be in itself a very interesting conversation we could have, you know, about the political nature. I mean, yeah, you have it a lot with Barad as well. People say, what have they what has it got to do with feminism, right? Because it's not explicitly about feminism, although I think it's deeply feminist. But anyway, let's go. I don't want to ignore Hillary's question. Hillary, would you like to just read it out yourself?
Sure, but before I do that, I want to say that, I've read the McClure on data that glows, but I'd never thought of the glow in relation to affect, and that it's affect that's making it glow. And I find that very useful. So I really like that a lot, because I think it gives me a different way of feeling the glow and thinking about the glow. So thanks for that. I was just wondering if you would talk about how you see the similarities and differences between Deleuze and Guattari's notion of assemblage and Barad's notion of the phenomena.
Nice.
Yeah. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on Deleuze's and Guattari's work, because there are too many people who spend their lives being expert, and they're a rough crowd. So I would say I feel more comfortable talking about the way the concept of assemblage has been taken up in the social science and educational research literature, because I've spent more time on that. And I've read a lot of Barad, so I read Barad as distinct from the assemblage studies. I mean, I know they're influencing each other, so I'm not trying to say there's some firewall between them and they don't ever talk to each other, because that's not true. But engaged in somewhat divergent projects. My read on the assemblages are desiring machines, as I understand it, Deleuze and Guattari's work. And so their theory of the assemblage is tied up with their theory of desire. By my read, the theory of desire is the appeal of the theory of desire and the assemblages that are composed of these desiring machines is that it creates it provides a means for thinking about how thought moves beyond hegemonic boundaries that encompass thought. So the challenge of hegemony is we don't know we're in a hegemony, that it's completely encloses our thoughts. And so if we have a conception of rationality, if we have a conception of right and wrong, et cetera, that sort of bounds the way in which we think, we're always thinking inside of the circles within this. This is sort of related to Vivian's comment about how any particular review was caught up in the algorithms we're a part of. The algorithms are part of much larger sort of ideological and discursive systems. And the concept of desire, because of its almost stochastic, I won't say irrational, but non-rational nature. When I say non-rational, meaning not within the given conceptions of rationality, it allows for divergent sort of lines of flight that are fundamentally destabilizing to the existing social orders and social fabric. I mean, I think that's a direct quote close to from Deleuze and Guattari. So that's an important sort of, it gets us out of a sort of the prisons of our thought and systems of affect, but it doesn't provide a sort of directionality to where it's going to go. I think that Barad's conception of the phenomenon is doing something similar, in the sense that Barad wants us to pay attention to the materiality and the sort of any language we use here gets us into trouble. So she chooses the word phenomenon, but the phenomenon is not an object separate from my subject looking at it. The phenomenon is the relation, right? And so when we move into that relation, it is changing us and it's changing the thing, right? And so Barad's account of that is decenters the representational process of trying to say what's true by moving closer to the encounter with the things that we're in relation studying. Whereas the concept of assemblage and concepts like data that glow I'll just say with the assemblage, doesn't get quite as close to it, right? The assemblage is still something that we're sort of both either a part of or looking at, whereas Bharat is trying to give us a way to think through what it is that is happening to us as we engage in this, so that we can be more thoughtful about that engagement in really particular ways. So it feels to me that Bharat's concept of phenomena puts more ballast in the thingness of what we're engaging. Whereas the Deleuzian conception of assemblage, because it's based on the conception of the desiring machine, still remains more what it is that's happening inside of me that takes me to this place, as opposed to what it is about the thingness that is transforming me. I don't think they're like either or, but you asked me to draw a distinction, and so that's how I would say, based on my limited knowledge, that the distinction I see there.
If would you like to say more about the desire in Bharat's work, and with the lightning and the void,
Yeah.
especially in relation to the political nature, I think, and a decolonizing nature of the work. And I think you mentioned it as well in your article, hauntology, that is the stuff that the concept that really has been taken up by Viv and other colleagues in Bharat's work. So I don't know whether that's what you were thinking of, Viv.
Yeah, well, I was thinking particularly of the lightning, and remember that, I don't know if you recollect that piece in Transmateriality, but there was Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, and the desire, and those frogs' legs that were moving. So, I mean, I suppose the desire is taken out of the human realm. And, I found that the lightning with the step leaders sort of looking towards the earth, sort of never, it as a form of responsiveness, an interesting way of thinking about ethics too. I think desire and touching feature quite, strongly in Bharat's work, but I don't know about assemblages as desiring machines, and how that, what one would do with that, and how it's very different. But I would think that, so the materiality also of desire comes about in the void, and the sort of talking about that the void is never void, and they use that paragraph about the dressed particle, sort of playing on the physics terms, but it sounds very improbable. So I think that it would be interesting to see, how that form of assemblage relates to Bharat's work. Also, not much has been said about Erin Manning, and I think that she also talks quite a lot about assemblage as a agencement, as something which is sort of more agentic almost, than thinking about it. Assemblage is a phenomenon. And I was interested to see that Manning didn't really appear in your article, and wondered why.
I mean, I've read Manning. there are so many things that don't show up in that article that I don't really know how to describe it. I mean, certainly I read Linda Toy Smith and spent some time with her, but yeah. So I don't have an answer for why Masumi and not Manning, except that I suppose I feel more influenced kind of immediately by Masumi. The question about assemblages, I think it's helpful to keep in mind that there's two ways the assemblage works. One is that the assemblage is a thing, it's a shift in a unit of analysis that doesn't allow the thing we're studying to be ontologically singular and allows it to be dynamic. But it's also that the researchers themselves are always a part of assemblages. Assemblages are nested within assemblages in the same way that, you know, non-human agency is nested within various levels of non-human agency. So I think these concepts function in kind of parallel ways. But I agree with what I think I hear Dr. Bozelek saying, is that they're different concepts in what they end up emphasizing and what their conceptual genealogy is. So I don't like Lisa Mazzei and Alicia Jackson have written about agentic assemblages. So they have an article on those things. So I think maybe they're drawing on Manning as well. So I don't feel prepared to actually say whether the concept of agency, as maybe Manning takes it up, or as the way that Jackson and Mazzei take it up in agentic assemblages, whether the concept of agency there is being transformed as it moves into relationship with the concept of assemblage, or whether it is sort of an easy fit in that, you know, between the two. I think agency is a really complicated concept itself, at least the way it's sort of brought into our conversations by say Karen Barad, but also the way it's manifest in some of the Indigenous studies literature. I find some of the really most compelling accounts of non-human agency in the Indigenous studies literature. And this gets back to the point that I think you were making, Karen, that there's a way in which Karen Barad is engaged in an internal conversation, trying to pry sort of Western thoughts, you know, white knuckled grip from the object of study and its metaphysical presence into some other kind of relation that's more ethically and politically responsible. I think that's what's going on. But if you look at the Indigenous studies literature on non-human agency, they're not engaged in that internal conversation. They never really, a lot of these authors do a lot of work. You know, there are Indigenous studies authors that are writing to primarily Western audiences, like, here, you guys need to think about this. But there are Indigenous studies authors, increasingly large numbers of them, that are just not engaging that game. They're just like, no, we need to think about this on our own terms, in terms of our own philosophical traditions. And in those conversations about non-human agency, there's no sort of, there's less undertow of the idea that there's an object there that we need to describe. There's an assumption of an ethically reciprocal relationship. And the question is, how do we engage in that in a constructive way? And it's not straightforward, right? What counts as an agent, what it's going to be. Like the idea, there's Ava Garut and Kathleen Westcott's article on stories as narratives. And so for those of us who engage in sort of narrative forms of representation in our work, the idea that stories have agency and we have an ethical responsibility to the stories and what it means for stories to be alive. And then there's Michael Marker's brilliant work, the late Michael Marker, who writes about the agency of places. And he has a concept of the agency of places as being, the places are sentient. And then when you move to the place, it's a merging of the human sentience and the place sentience. And so that minds and thoughts and affect become possible that aren't possible any other place, right? And so this is a conception of, like, when you talk about data that glows, that's kind of, there's something that feels really abstract about that. But Marker's account of the agency of a place actually I've been to places where I feel different and I think differently. And, you know, is that my imagination? Maybe, who knows? But Marker's giving an account of what the experience or what it feels like to be within a transformation of agency. So I think there's a real imperative, a real importance to engaging that Indigenous literature, because it's got leverage on moving outside of a Western taken for granted frame that's different than some of the literature that's more kind of internalized.
I've got the very difficult job of just closing this session because it's just fascinating. If you can put some of those references in the chat, and also not forgetting Elena's comment here, it is how much she appreciates the team's engagement with Black and Indigenous studies, and that she's familiar with Black and Indigenous scholars, emphasizing the importance of citational practice that recognize and use their work. And it's followed by the question, but I'm afraid we haven't got time for the question, is where does the concern of appropriating these bodies of work come up? And actually, it's really good, I think, to finish with a question. And it is an ongoing conversation, and I'm just very grateful for people attending, joining in, thinking with, and of course, Jerry, with your work. And, it must be frustrating for you as well to, there's so much scholarship involved in putting a review like this together. And then, but why is this not in there? Or why is that not? How and what. But really appreciate that this is just in the world, as a world in practice, and that we can engage with it and work with it and take it further all together too. And I know that George has asked me, please leave a bit of time to just make an announcement of what else is happening this month. And also for this recording, what we need to think about is the technical side of how can we, and the QR code, and also presentation, make it part of what's going to be recorded and saved, right, for other people to join in. So thank you very much, Jerry. Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you much, George. And then I'll leave the announcement to you, and then people can just in their own time.
I'll start by saying a personal thank you as well. I'm in the process of trying to do post-human research myself, and I found this very helpful. So a personal thank you. And then also, I just thought I would let everyone know that so this was a kind of like a special session because there are 5 weeks in September. But from next week, we will start engaging with Sylvia Kine's work. And at the end of this month, we will have a panel with her entitled Artful and Material Returnings. And then the other thing and then if you go to our website, you can see the other things that are planned, but just also to say that on the 20th of September, there'll be a book launch, which is happening in Oulu, but we will also be, hopefully it will have an online component as well. So stay tuned for that. And if anyone would like to join the reading groups for the post-qual reading group, and you're not yet on our WhatsApp group, I'm sending my email address in the chat, and you can just send me an email and we can take it from there.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
So I'm going to stop recording.
Jerry, if you want to stay a little bit longer, you can. And Alex as well for a warm down. Is that I think that's in football, isn't it? Something like that. Are you very welcome to, but if you have to rush off, then that's also fine.